In the middle of a frozen forest, a young woman stood over a pit of black ice water, shovel trembling in her hands. Below her, a pregnant German shepherd was being buried alive. Slowly, silently. Then a former Navy SEAL heard the sound and ran toward what everyone else had chosen to ignore. One interruption would expose a hidden crime and reveal how quiet evil meets mercy and how God still protects the innocent. Before we begin, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Your single click truly means more than you know. God bless you for keeping hope alive. Winter had sealed the Wyoming forest into a state of rigid stillness, snow pressing down on earth and sound alike, while a low wind moved through the pines, carrying something heavy through the cold air. Luke Anderson slowed the moment he heard it. The sound did not belong to winter. It was not the sharp crack of ice shifting under pressure, nor the brittle collapse of frozen soil. This was wet, dense. A dull impact followed by the low, hollow movement of water disturbed beneath ice. At 35, Luke had learned to trust what reached him before thought did. He stopped moving, breath controlled, shoulders squared, eyes narrowing toward the pale forest ahead. Tall and lean, with broad shoulders shaped by years of military conditioning, he carried himself with the quiet balance of someone long accustomed to unstable ground. His face was angular, square at the jaw, darkened by short, uneven stubble. Steel blue eyes sat deep beneath a brow, permanently set in focus rather than tension, and his cropped dark hair was streaked faintly with premature gray. Silence had followed him since leaving the Navy SEALs 3 years earlier. He had learned that silence was rarely empty. The sound came again, snow mixed with slush, striking water. Luke stepped off the narrow trail and moved down slope, careful with each footfall. Snow creaked softly beneath his boots as the air grew damper, carrying a faint metallic scent that should not have existed at this temperature. Ahead, the snow lay broken in unnatural patterns. Footprints cut through it, fresh and purposeful, not wandering, not confused. He followed them into a small clearing where the ground dipped sharply. As if something beneath the surface had been forced open. The pit had been carved through ice and frozen earth with deliberate effort. Jagged sheets of broken ice lay scattered around its rim, their translucent edges catching weak winter light. Inside, dark water pooled thick and sluggish, nearly black against the surrounding white. Standing at the edge was a young woman. She was slight, of average height, her narrow frame held rigid as if tension were the only thing keeping her upright. Dark hair hung loose down her back, damp with falling snow. Her pale skin was flushed raw by cold, lips pressed thin. In her hands was a shovel. The shovel's blade was coated with wet snow, ice fragments, and brown slush. She lifted it, scooped, and threw the mixture into the pit. The water responded with a heavy splash that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the forest. She did not rush. She did not pause. Her movements were steady, mechanical, as though she were completing a task rather than reacting to what lay below. Luke remained at the edge of the trees, watching, something cold settling deep in his chest. Then he saw the dog, a German shepherd, female, large and solidly built, half of her body submerged in the freezing water. Her thick coat was soaked and darkened, ice clinging to her fur along her chest and shoulders. Her belly was swollen, unmistakably pregnant, rising and falling unevenly with fast, strained breaths that sent thin plumes of steam into the air. The water reached high along her torso, lapping against her ribs as broken ice and slush continued to fall. Her hind legs lay nearly motionless beneath the surface, claimed by the cold. Luke did not need to see more. This was not a fall, not an accident. The pit was too deliberate, the method too quiet. Snow and ice were being added slowly, intentionally, raising the water level inch by inch. No shouting, no violence, no witnesses. Water and cold would finish the work, and winter would erase the rest. Luke stood motionless as another load of slush fell into the pit, and the water climbed higher around the pregnant dog. This was a burial, carried out slowly and with purpose, and the forest remained silent as it happened. The dog did not make a sound. No bark split the air, no panicked thrashing disturbed the dark water filling the pit. From the edge of the trees, Luke Anderson watched as the German shepherd remained unnervingly still, her breath fast and shallow but controlled, her body aligned with purpose rather than instinctive fear. Snow continued to fall, settling on her wet fur and dissolving into it immediately, adding weight without relief. The water line crept higher with every shovel of slush thrown down from above, yet the dog did not surrender to it. Instead, she adjusted, slowly, deliberately, shifting her weight to keep her head and swollen abdomen above the surface. It was not desperation guiding her movements. It was calculation. Luke felt the change inside himself before he could name it. In Chapter 1, he had recognized intent in the act. Here, in this suspended moment, he began to recognize discipline in the victim. The shepherd's ears stayed flattened, not pinned in terror but set low, as if minimizing exposure. Her neck remained extended, muscles taut, conserving strength. Each time the water surged higher, she repositioned with minimal movement, wasting no energy. This was not how untrained animals behaved. Panic burned energy fast. Instinct fought blindly. What he was seeing instead was restraint, the kind taught through repetition, correction, and expectation. Luke had seen it in men under fire, the way they breathed when everything screamed to run. He had worn it himself once. The dog's eyes lifted briefly toward the rim of the pit, not pleading, not accusing. They were dark and alert, tracking motion, measuring distance, assessing time. Even as the cold tightened its grip on her hind legs, she did not flail. She let them go still, as if already aware they were lost for now. What mattered was buoyancy. What mattered was keeping the life inside her out of the water. Luke watched her arch her back just enough to shift the curve of her belly higher, sacrificing balance to protect it. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to someone who understood controlled response under pressure. She was not fighting to escape. She was fighting to endure. Above her, the woman continued to shovel. The rhythm never changed. Snow, ice, mud, lift, throw, splash, lift, throw, splash. The sound echoed softly and died quickly in the trees. Luke studied her from where he stood. She did not look down often, only enough to place her aim. Her shoulders remained squared. Her stance planted despite the slick ground. She was not trembling now. Whatever conflict might have existed earlier had settled into function. Her face, when Luke could see it in profile, remained empty of expression, as if emotion had been shut away to make room for completion. She did not hurry the process. That was what unsettled him most. If this had been rage, it would have been loud. If fear, it would have been rushed. This was neither. This was patience. Another shovel fell. The water rose to the dog's upper chest. The shepherd inhaled sharply, her breath hitching once before smoothing again. Luke felt his jaw tighten. The cold had begun to steal sensation from her body, but not her awareness. She adjusted again, smaller this time, careful not to upset the fragile balance keeping her afloat. Her body trembled now, not violently, but constantly, a fine vibration under strain. Luke knew that kind of tremor. It was what happened when strength was rationed to the edge of collapse. He had seen it in men holding positions too long, refusing to break, because breaking would cost something greater than pain. Understanding settled with clarity that left no room for doubt. This dog had been trained to obey commands under stress, to remain still when every instinct demanded movement. She had been taught to hold, to wait, to endure discomfort until released. That training had not left her when she was discarded. It was still there, guiding her now as she stood in freezing water, protecting her unborn pups with the same discipline once demanded of her in service. Luke felt the weight of that realization press down on him. Whoever had put her here knew exactly what they were doing. They were counting on the cold to outlast her training. The woman lifted the shovel again. Luke tracked the arc of the blade as it moved, the way the slush slid free and struck the water. The pit responded with another dull surge. The shepherd's head rose higher, throat stretched, muzzle lifted clear of the surface. Her eyes never closed. Luke noticed that too. Animals slipping into hypothermia often lost focus first. This one had not. She was still present, still fighting in the only way left to her. Time was narrowing. The water did not need to reach her mouth. It only needed to reach the point where she could no longer maintain balance. Luke remained where he was. His body was coiled, every muscle alert, but he did not move. Not yet. Acting too soon would change nothing. Acting too late would change everything. He measured distance, terrain, footing, the woman's position, the dog's remaining strength. He forced himself to stay still, to watch, to understand fully what was unfolding. Snow brushed against his face, melted against his eyelashes. The forest remained indifferent, bearing silent witness. Another shovel fell, another rise of water. The shepherd shifted again, slower now, but precise. She held herself above the surface, breath burning in her chest, waiting. Above her, the woman continued her work. And in that narrow space between rising water and failing strength, Luke understood that this was the last stretch before submersion, the final margin where endurance alone decided the outcome. Luke Anderson moved before sound became language. The decision was not a thought, but a release, the kind that followed long seconds of restraint snapping cleanly. He broke from the trees and shouted, raw, forceful, unshaped by words, his voice cutting across the clearing and shattering the quiet that had allowed the burial to continue. Snow burst beneath his boots as he ran, momentum carrying him downhill toward the pit, breath tearing white into the air. The woman at the rim jerked in surprise, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, shoulders tightening as the shovel stalled mid-arc. The interruption came at the worst possible second. As the shovel faltered, a slab of loosened ice slid from the rim and dropped into the pit, displacing the water in a sudden, heavy surge. The level jumped to the dog's upper chest, slapping cold against her throat. The shepherd inhaled sharply, head snapping higher as her balance wavered. Her legs slipped beneath the surface, and for an instant she teetered on the edge of buoyancy. The woman's grip broke. The shovel clattered onto the snow, metal ringing once before silence reclaimed it. She stared, first at Luke, then at the pit, eyes wide, face stripped of its earlier emptiness and replaced by something close to panic. Luke reached the edge as the woman stumbled backward. Up close, she was younger than he had expected, early 20s at most, her frame narrow and underweight for the cold she had been standing in. Her cheeks were chapped raw, lashes clotted with snow, breath coming in short bursts as if she had been holding it for too long. There was no confrontation, no exchange. She took one more look at the pit, then turned and ran, boots slipping as she disappeared into the trees, pinked skin and dark hair flashing once between branches before the forest swallowed her whole. Luke did not pursue. His focus had already narrowed to the pit. He dropped to his knees at the rim, snow biting through his jeans as he leaned forward. The dog's head sagged dangerously low now, muzzle skimming the surface as her breath came in ragged pulls. Luke slid down the edge and plunged both arms into the water without hesitation. The cold struck like impact, a living thing that tore at skin and muscle, driving pain straight into bone. He locked his jaw and reached deeper, hands finding the dog's chest and shoulders beneath the waterline, fingers digging into soaked fur until he had purchase. The shepherd did not fight him. She did not thrash or snap. Her body was rigid with shock rather than resistance, muscles locked as if awaiting command. Luke braced his boots against the pit's edge and lifted with controlled force, using his legs rather than his back, drawing her up inch by inch as water spilled away in dull splashes. When her weight cleared the rim, he rolled backward, dragging her onto the snow. She collapsed heavily at his side, sides heaving, steam pouring from her mouth as her body shuddered with violent tremors. "Easy," Luke said, the word steady despite the way his hands shook from cold. He stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her torso, pulling the fabric tight to trap what little heat she had left. He rubbed hard along her ribs and shoulders, coaxing circulation back into stiffened muscle. Up close, she was magnificent even in collapse, broad-chested, powerfully built, her coat thick beneath ice and water. Her eyes tracked him with unsettling focus, not fear but awareness, as if confirming that the interruption was real. Luke estimated her age at 3 or 4, young enough to recover, old enough to have been trained thoroughly. The swollen curve of her belly pressed against the snow as she curled instinctively around it. He checked her airway, brushed ice from her muzzle, then leaned in close to listen to her breathing. Each breath rasped, uneven but present. He felt the tremors shift, violent shaking giving way to smaller, steadier quakes as warmth began its slow return. The pit behind them steamed faintly now, disturbed water settling as the snow continued to fall. Luke glanced once toward the trees where the woman had vanished, then back to the dog. The moment for pursuit had passed. What mattered was here. Luke gathered her carefully, arms slipping beneath her chest and hips, lifting her against his body. She was heavy but cooperative, her head sagging briefly against his shoulder as if conceding the effort to him. He adjusted his grip to keep her belly supported, feeling the rigid strength beneath the trembling. The cold burned less now, replaced by a dull ache as blood returned to his forearms. He stood slowly, testing his footing, then began the short, careful walk back toward the trail. Behind them, the pit remained, a dark mouth in the snow, water lapping quietly at broken ice. Luke did not look back again. He focused on the weight in his arms, on the steadying rhythm of the dog's breath against his chest. On the simple truth that she had been pulled from the water with seconds to spare. Snow continued to fall, already softening the edges of what had nearly happened, but the clearing would not forget the interruption. Neither would he. Luke reached the cabin with the dog cradled against his chest, her weight dragging steadily at his arms as the cold finally began to release its grip. The cabin sat low among the pines, weather-beaten and practical, its logs darkened by years of wind and snow. Luke had built it himself after leaving the Navy, not for comfort, but for control. Inside, the space was sparse. One room, a small kitchen area, a table scarred by use, and a wood stove that dominated the far wall. He shouldered the door open and crossed the threshold in long strides, setting the dog down on a thick wool rug near the stove. The heat inside felt almost unreal after the forest, heavy and close. He fed the fire until sparks leapt and warmth pushed outward, then knelt beside her, hands moving with careful urgency. The German shepherd lay on her side, sides heaving. Tremors still racking her body, though they had softened from violent to persistent. Up close, her condition was clearer. She was in her prime, broad chest, strong neck, powerful shoulders, yet the cold had leached strength from her limbs. Her coat, once thick and well kept, was matted with ice and water, clinging close to her skin. Luke worked methodically, drying her with old towels, rubbing circulation back into her legs, speaking quietly without realizing he was doing it. His voice was steady, low, the same tone he had once used on men who needed to hear something familiar while the world broke around them. The dog watched him through half-lidded eyes, alert despite exhaustion, tracking his movements with unsettling focus. When he checked her gums and felt her pulse, she did not resist. She endured. Luke noticed the pregnancy fully now. Her belly was heavy, the skin stretched tight beneath fur, the outline of life undeniable beneath his hands. He felt a familiar knot settle in his chest, not panic, but responsibility. Hypothermia and shock in a pregnant dog were a dangerous combination. Even with warmth returning, the risk of early labor loomed. He adjusted her position to keep pressure off her abdomen, supporting her back and hips with folded blankets. "Grace," he said without thinking, the name surfacing unbidden. It felt right in his mouth, simple and unforced. The dog's ears twitched faintly at the sound, but she did not move away. The name stayed. As her breathing steadied incrementally, Luke began a more careful examination. He checked her paws for damage, noting abrasions and raw pads where ice had cut through toughness meant for rough ground, not frozen water. Then, as he parted the fur behind her left ear to check for injury, his fingers paused. There, beneath the fur line, was a small tattoo, clean, precise, inked with deliberate lines and numbers. Not decorative, not random, identification. Luke felt his stomach tighten. He had seen markings like this before, years ago, in places that did not officially exist, training programs that denied their own shadows, assets that were never meant to be acknowledged once their usefulness ended. "You're not a stray," Luke said quietly. The dog's eyes flicked toward him, sharp despite fatigue. He cleaned the area gently, careful not to irritate the skin, memorizing the mark without staring too long. The implication settled heavily. Someone had gone to effort to make this animal disappear, not abandon her, not relocate her, erase her. The method made sense now. Ice, water, snow, no bullet, no blade, no visible crime, a death that could be explained away by winter and bad luck. Luke leaned back on his heels, the fire crackling softly behind him, and let the truth settle fully into place. Grace shifted suddenly, her body tensing beneath his hands. Luke leaned in at once, watching her posture change. She was restless now, breathing uneven again, muscles along her abdomen tightening in subtle waves. Not full labor, not yet, but close enough to matter. Shock and cold could trigger contractions. He adjusted the blankets, kept his hands warm against her sides, monitoring the rhythm of her breathing. Outside, wind pressed against the cabin walls, a reminder of how close disaster still lingered. Luke stayed with her through the long stretch that followed, feeding the fire, listening to the small sounds of her body fighting its way back toward stability. He did not sleep. Sometime near dawn, the worst of the tremors eased. Grace lay quieter now, her breathing slower, deeper, though tension still lived beneath her skin. Luke sat back against the wall, exhaustion settling into his bones in a familiar way. This was not the clean ending he would have preferred. The rescue complete, the danger past. This was the beginning of something else. The tattoo behind her ear burned in his thoughts. Programs did not simply lose track of assets like this. Someone would notice. Someone would come looking, if they were already not. Luke checked the door locks, then the windows, habit taking over without conscious instruction. Grace watched him as he moved, her head lifting slightly with each shift of his position. When he returned to her side, she exhaled and rested her head against the floor, eyes never leaving him. Luke rested a hand briefly on her neck, feeling the solid warmth there now, the steady pulse beneath skin and fur. What she had survived was not supposed to leave survivors. That much was clear. Whatever plan had put her into the ice pit had assumed finality. Luke understood that as well as anyone. He had lived inside plans built on that assumption before. He rose as daylight crept through the small cabin window, the fire still burning, Grace still breathing, and accepted the quiet truth settling into place. Saving her had not ended anything. It had interrupted something that was never meant to be interrupted. The signs appeared quietly, the way real danger often did. Luke noticed them not all at once, but in fragments that refused to stay separate. Grace had grown restless through the night, her breathing uneven, muscles along her abdomen tightening in shallow, irregular waves that spoke of stress more than timing. Luke stayed close, monitoring her, adjusting blankets, keeping the fire steady. Outside, dawn revealed a new layer of snow, clean, unbroken at first glance. It was only when Luke stepped beyond the cabin's shadow that he saw the interruption. Tire tracks, wide, deliberate, cut deep into the snow before curving away, careful not to come too close. Not lost, not accidental. Someone had come to look, then chosen distance. Luke crouched beside the tracks, fingers brushing the compressed snow. Fresh, hours old at most. He followed their arc with his eyes, noting how they looped wide, avoiding the direct approach. A perimeter, not a visit. When he straightened, his gaze caught on something near the woodpile. A black plastic zip tie lay half-buried, cleanly cut and placed where it would be noticed only by someone who knew to look. Luke picked it up, turning it between his fingers. It was not trash. It was a message. He had seen the same tactic years ago in places where intimidation was meant to be quiet, deniable, a reminder that someone knew where you were and wanted you to know it too. Inside, Grace shifted again, a low sound vibrating in her chest. Not a whine, not a cry, but discomfort. Luke moved back to her side at once, kneeling, checking her belly, her breathing. She was warm now, alive, but the tension beneath her skin had not eased. Early labor was still a risk. He rested his hand lightly against her flank, feeling the faint movement beneath, and made the decision he had been circling since the night before. He did not reach for the radio. He reached for the satellite phone locked in the drawer beneath the table. He had told himself he kept it for emergencies only. This qualified. Tom Harris answered on the third ring. Tom was in his early 40s, tall and spare, his build still lean from years in uniform, though softened slightly by time behind desks. His face was long and weathered, lines etched deep at the corners of his eyes and mouth, dark hair cut short and already graying at the temples. A trimmed beard shadowed his jaw, kept neat out of habit rather than vanity. Tom's voice carried the calm of a man who had learned to absorb bad news without flinching. Shaped by too many nights when panic only made things worse. He had served alongside Luke years ago, the kind of teammate who spoke little but listened fully, and who did not forget debts, moral or otherwise. Luke did not waste words. He described the pit, the ice, the dog, the tattoo. He mentioned the tracks, the zip tie. Tom listened without interrupting, the silence on the line heavy, but focused. When Luke finished, Tom exhaled slowly. "You didn't imagine this," he said, "and you didn't interrupt something small." Tom explained what he could, carefully. There had been whispers for months, unofficial complaints, sealed reports about a shadow procurement pipeline handling working dogs deemed non-viable. Injuries, behavioral flags, pregnancies, especially pregnancies, liability risks, public optics. Dogs that could not be quietly reassigned were quietly removed. No paperwork, no trace. Tom did not say who was behind it. He didn't have to. Systems like that never belong to one person. As they spoke, the two timelines began to align with unsettling precision. Grace's condition, pregnant, trained, marked, fit too cleanly. The method, ice, water, winter, fit better still. A disappearance disguised as misfortune. Tom's voice hardened slightly as he spoke, not with anger, but with something colder. Recognition. "If they've already been to your cabin," he said, "then they know she survived. And if they know that, they'll want control of the outcome." Luke looked down at Grace as she shifted again, eyes lifting to him briefly, before settling. control. He had lived under that word before. He did not intend to again. Tom advised caution, not retreat. He told Luke to document everything, preserve the zip tie, photograph the tracks before the next snowfall erased them. He would start making calls on his end, pulling threads quietly, the way investigations like this had to begin. No sirens, no uniforms. Not yet. Luke agreed, his gaze drifting to the window where snow continued to fall, already softening the evidence outside. When the call ended, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the outside world had begun to press in. Grace's breathing hitched again, sharper this time. Luke moved instantly, kneeling beside her, feeling the tension crest and ease. Not labor, not yet, but close enough to matter. He stayed there, hand steady on her side, aware now that he was no longer operating in a single timeline. One thread ran through the cabin: fire, warmth, a pregnant dog fighting to carry life to term. The other stretched outward, tracks in snow, cut plastic, quiet systems that erased problems without noise. They were no longer separate. They had intersected here, in this place, because someone had assumed Grace would not survive long enough to matter. Luke sat back on his heels as night fell again, exhaustion settling deep but unused. Outside, the tracks were fading. Inside, Grace was still breathing. He understood now that saving her had not simply delayed an ending. It had forced a collision. Whatever had been meant to disappear had instead drawn attention, and attention once drawn rarely stayed quiet for long. The storm arrived without drama, the way the worst ones often did. Snow thickened first, falling heavier and faster until the world beyond the cabin windows dissolved into a moving wall of white. Wind followed, pressing against the logs with a low, constant force that made the structure creak and settle. Inside, the fire burned steady and bright, its heat pooling close, while the rest of the room remained cold enough to remind Luke Anderson that winter still held authority here. Grace lay on her side near the stove, body tense, breathing uneven, the signs unmistakable now. This was no longer the threat of early labor. It had begun. Luke knelt beside her, sleeves rolled, hands already red from heat and cold in equal measure. He moved with careful urgency, guided by instinct and memory rather than training. He had delivered men from worse conditions before, but this was different. This was quieter, more fragile. Grace's body tightened in waves, muscles along her abdomen contracting with increasing strength. She did not cry out. She endured, eyes open, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall, as if drawing strength from distance. Luke spoke to her steadily, voice low and constant, the same cadence he once used to anchor teammates through chaos. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside, life pushed forward. The first puppy arrived slowly, slick and small, its body limp for a terrifying second, before a thin, sharp cry cut through the room. Luke's breath released in a rush he hadn't realized he was holding. He worked quickly, clearing airways, rubbing warmth into fragile skin, then placing the pup against Grace's belly. She responded instantly, tongue moving with focused efficiency, her exhaustion giving way to purpose. The second followed sooner, then the third, each arrival carried on the same rhythm of strain, release, and fragile sound. By the time the fourth pup was born, Luke's hands shook, not from cold this time, but from the accumulated weight of the moment. 4 lives, small and breathing, pressed close to their mother beneath the glow of firelight. Grace sagged back against the blankets, sides heaving, but her eyes softened as she gathered the puppies closer. They were small, dark shapes against her pale belly, their movements weak but determined. Luke checked her carefully, monitoring bleeding, breathing, the tension in her muscles easing at last. She was exhausted, but stable. The storm raged on outside, wind howling now. But inside the cabin, the world narrowed to breath, warmth, and the quiet persistence of life. Luke fed the fire again and sat back on his heels, watching the scene settle. He felt no triumph, only relief, edged with something heavier. Survival did not erase what had been done. It simply refused to be erased itself. By morning, the storm had begun to break. Snow still fell, but the wind had eased, leaving the forest hushed under a thick, unbroken blanket. Luke moved carefully, stepping outside long enough to document what remained visible. Faded tracks, disturbed snow, angles that would matter later. Inside, the satellite phone crackled to life again. Tom Harris's voice carried less tension now, more weight. The investigation had moved faster than Luke expected, propelled by evidence that had been waiting too long for someone to pull it together. Records, shell accounts, off-book transfers. A program that existed only in fragments until those fragments were aligned. There were no raids, no shouted orders. Just warrants served quietly, offices opened, files seized. People who believed themselves untouchable discovered that silence cut both ways. Tom confirmed what Luke had suspected about the girl in the clearing. She was not a planner, not a decision-maker. She had been pressured, directed, given instructions, and just enough fear to obey. When confronted with the full scope of what she had been used for, she broke quickly. Statements followed. Names, timelines. Her role ended, not with punishment, but with exposure. Her actions documented within a structure that showed where responsibility truly belonged. Luke listened without interruption, eyes resting on Grace as she slept now, her puppies breathing in uneven unison against her side. There was no satisfaction in the news, only a sober acknowledgement that systems, once exposed, collapsed under their own weight. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Officials came and went without spectacle, dressed plainly, speaking softly, their presence more administrative than confrontational. They documented Grace's condition, photographed the tattoo behind her ear, collected samples and statements. Luke answered questions carefully, truthfully, without embellishment. No one raised a weapon. No one needed to. Paperwork did the work. Violence never could. Slow, thorough, unavoidable. The program that had marked Grace for erasure unraveled piece by piece, its defenders unable to hide behind winter once the thaw began. When the last vehicle left, the cabin returned to its earlier stillness. Grace stirred as Luke closed the door, lifting her head briefly before settling again, eyes following him with quiet trust. The puppies shifted, small bodies pressing closer, unaware of how close they had come to never existing at all. Luke sat beside them, one hand resting lightly against Grace's side, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. Outside, snow continued to fall, gentler now, no longer threatening. Life had refused to sink, not just in the ice pit, but in every place where it had been expected to disappear quietly. Spring arrived without ceremony, the way it often did in the high country, first as a loosening rather than a change. Snow thinned along the edges of the clearing, retreating in uneven patches that revealed dark soil and flattened grass beneath, stunned to be seen again. Meltwater traced narrow paths down the slope, carrying winter away, grain by grain. Luke Anderson noticed the shift in his body before he named it. The cold that had lived in his shoulders all season had begun to ease, replaced by a quieter weight. The cabin stood the same, logs weathered, roof low, but the air around it felt different, less watchful. On the porch, Grace lay stretched in the pale sun, her coat renewed with a healthy sheen. The light caught the gentle rise of her flank as she breathed, steady and unhurried, while 4 pups tumbled and dozed at her side. Their movements clumsy and earnest, life learning itself without urgency. The puppies had grown quickly. Their eyes were open now, bright and curious, each with a distinct way of meeting the world. One favored exploration, nose always leading, another preferred closeness, pressing into Grace's warmth with contented insistence. Their coats were thickening, colors sharpening, small bodies filling out with strength, earned simply by being allowed to exist. Grace watched them with a vigilance that had softened into confidence. She no longer flinched at distant sounds. The hard edge of endurance had rounded into ease. When Luke stepped onto the porch, she lifted her head, ears tilting toward him, then settled again, trusting the space she occupied. He knelt briefly to check the pups, hands gentle, movements practiced now, and felt the quiet satisfaction of routine replacing crisis. The cabin's purpose had changed without announcement. What began as shelter had become refuge. Luke had not posted signs or filed papers or given speeches. He simply opened the door when the need appeared. A former handler brought an aging patrol dog whose joints no longer tolerated long nights. A ranger left a young shepherd deemed too sensitive for field work but too trained to be placed casually. Each arrival was met with the same calm assessment, warmth first, then time. Luke's presence was steady rather than reassuring. He did not promise outcomes, only care. He learned the rhythms of different temperaments, the small tells that signaled stress or contentment. He kept records because accuracy mattered, but he spoke to the dogs because they did too. The place acquired a reputation without acquiring a name. People passed through occasionally, quietly, briefly. An older veterinarian with weathered hands checked Grace and the pups one afternoon, her movements efficient and kind, her sandy hair pulled back at the nape of her neck, blue eyes missing nothing. She nodded at Luke's setups, approved of the routines, left supplies he pretended not to need. A former colleague stopped by once, stayed long enough to share coffee in silence, then left with a promise that did not require repeating. There were no ceremonies, no declarations of closure. The world beyond the trees continued at its own pace, but the cabin held its ground, doing the simple work it had chosen. On a morning when the sun carried more warmth than glare, Luke walked the shoreline path toward the clearing where winter had almost finished its work. The ground was soft beneath his boots, forgiving in a way frozen earth never was. He stopped at the edge of the old pit. What remained was not a wound, but a shallow basin of clear water, ringed by damp earth and new grass. The ice was gone entirely. He watched the surface for a long moment as it reflected sky instead of trapping it, the water moving freely now, unafraid of depth. He did not measure time or distance or risk. He simply stood, hands at his sides, and allowed the memory to settle without pressing against it. Grace approached without command, pausing a few steps away. She looked at the water, ears forward, posture calm. The pups milled behind her, distracted by insects and scent, unaware of what this place had once demanded. Luke did not reach for her collar. There was none, and he did not speak. He waited. Grace took one step closer, then another, then stopped. She watched the ripples move across the surface, her reflection breaking and reforming until she turned deliberately away. The choice was unforced. Luke felt the breath leave him in a long, quiet release he hadn't known he was holding. He rested a hand briefly on her neck, felt the steady pulse there, and understood that some endings completed themselves only when no one hurried them. They returned to the cabin together. Afternoon light pooled on the porch boards, and the pups sprawled in it, bellies warm, limbs loose, sleep claiming them without negotiation. Luke sat on the steps with a mug cooling in his hands, listening to the soft sounds of a place no longer braced for impact. The season would turn again, as seasons did. Cold would return someday, as it always had. But the line had been crossed and redrawn, quieter this time. What had been saved did not require witness. It required presence and then release. When evening settled, Luke closed the door and let the lamps glow low. Grace chose her place near the hearth. The pups gathered against her, breathing in uneven harmony. Outside, meltwater whispered its way downhill, carrying winter into the distance. Luke stood for a moment in the doorway, then turned away without looking back. Some lives were rescued at the last second. Some moments did not need revisiting. What remained, when the ice melted, was enough. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder. They come quietly, through compassion, courage, and one choice to care. If you believe in God, believe this: He often works through ordinary people who refuse to look away. In everyday life, we may not face frozen lakes, but we face moments where kindness still matters. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, loyalty, and grace. May God bless you and your loved ones and guide you through every cold season toward warmth and peace.